Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode one, our first official episode. This is a podcast about political thinking, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. My name is 4IS and my co host, Mr. E. Mr. E, how are you going today?
Very well, thank you. 4IS. Excited to be here for our first official episode of the Revolutionary Think Tank. I think the pilot episode went quite well. We got some good feedback.
Yeah.
News. So yeah, excited to be here talking about what it is to be a revolutionary think tank.
Yes.
Yes.
We were actually discussing this before because I feel like in the pilot, we discussed what revolutionary means, but we kind of skipped over think tank. And we should probably let everyone know what a think tank is.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think, yes, the revolutionary think tank is a bit of a mystery. It's a coming together of two terms that are foreign to one another, I would say. And I think you might have had more to do with that than me, 4IS. So I'll let you start. Tell us, what is a think tank?
Okay. This may be a bit idyllic, but my interpretation of what a think tank is think of it as a policy institute and a research institute. So these sort of institutes, they look at economics, they look at government, they look at basically the policies and procedures that governments should do, and moving forward, kind of what they should invest in. So a typical example of this would be ASPI. So one of ASPI's chief jobs is, getting in those focus groups, getting in those researching topics where it's about the relationship of Australia and China, like basically their relationships, how they should be dealing with each other, and that sort of thing. So that's probably a quick broad stroke of what I would interpret what a think tank is.
So it's an institution of some form, a group, a society that sits outside of the arm of government, researches topics, to then influence government decisions.
I would classify it as a contemporary of a lobby group.
Right. Hence why you premised your little spiel there with idealistic, because I must admit, in my experience, the way that you described think tanks then was rather light on, and you made them sound very humane, which is nice. Which is nice for these think tanks, because in my experience, think tanks usually are in existence to push the agenda of a special interest group onto government to influence, public policy, and to make sure that that public policy is working in the interests of that group. It's not so much as this nice body that just hangs around because they love researching things and they just want to make sure that everything's done for the best interests of the people or the population or the country. They are groups that are formed, again, by a special interest group. Let's just pick a completely random part of society here. Let's say the corporate sector. And, obviously the corporate sector has some type of interest in, let's just say, economics and how the state of the economy is going. And they might pull together a bunch of economists then, some leaders in their field that, subscribe to a certain ideology. Let's pick one at random again. Let's say it's the neoliberal tradition. And they will pick these neoliberal style thinkers, these libertarians, and then say to them, here you go. Here's something that we need to see pushed through government. Here's some types of policy decisions that will be in our favour. Can you provide us some research and some understanding on these topics? And they'll take those topics to a policymaker. Maybe it's a political party. Maybe it's the whole of the House or the whole of the legislative body. They take that and they lobby those politicians, and they make sure that the policies that are being made about the economy are in line with their agenda. So that's what I know about think tanks. A bit more cynical than your view of the think tank there, but that's a traditional way that they've been used, or at least throughout the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st century. They might have started with more altruistic backgrounds, but revolutionary think tank, now that is something peculiar.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I wanted to put these two ideas together is that, well, I guess if we take further your glass half empty view of what a think tank is, and if you kind of view it in that lens, then those sort of, I guess, policy institutes, they're designed to push the agenda, or at least the propaganda of a certain way of thinking in a top-down system. If you create a think tank that, well, hopefully is a little bit more egalitarian, and instead, much like we was discussing last week, instead you do a bottom-up system, then you can actually promote policies that will benefit the people. And this is actually an idea that I want to do maybe later as the podcast grows, is that I actually want to speak to specialists within certain industries, whether that be psychology, whether that be town planning, and speak about their experience. And also, the whole point of a think tank is, where people or an industry should be moving forward. So speak to those people, talk about their experiences, where they see their industry, or at least where their industry needs to improve, and what are the steps in order to improve their industries. And I actually think that's really important for workers to move forward in society.
Think tank involving average people.
Yes.
Without a particular agenda apart from just the topic of revolution. And then, reaching out to average persons for a bit of contribution and a bit of knowledge. Interesting. Very interesting. But again, with a flavor that is encompassing the ideology of the masses, not special interest groups.
Yes.
There we go. I like that. Very strange. Like I said before, it doesn't really fit together with the whole idea of a think tank in my mind, but that's why it's catchy for me. Very interesting. So going on with that egalitarian kind of vein of things, I think a lot of our discussions in the last few months have been centered around a particular topic that, I think it's definitely having an important resurgence in the 21st century, and it's something that people are very, very interested in, and they always, I guess, they're interested to know more, but there's a lot of negativity around it. There's a lot of propaganda. Let's not even go negative. There's a lot of propaganda out there confusing the topic. And that topic is the idea of socialism, and it's something that we've debated a lot between ourselves, and we've talked about a lot. So I thought, that would be a good place to start episode number 1, if we're revolutionary, and the revolutionary movement, at least the last century, has been a socialist style revolution against the existing status quo, the existing order, which, depending on who you talk to, but let's just go with the idea that the main social order is a capitalist style system, supported by the political economy, which is a bourgeois or a liberal democracy. So if we look at things from an economic and political standpoint, we've got a liberal democracy supported by a capitalist system of organizing. Then the revolutionary approach to changing those systems of the last 50 to 100 years now has been this scary idea of socialism. So then the question begs, what is socialism? And I've talked to a lot of people since being here and since researching it. And there's some pretty basic questions that come up all the time. In my view, socialism, like at its core, well, look, if you want to talk about it scientifically, there's this idea of scientific socialism and scientific communism and Marxism and all that sort of stuff. If you look at it at its core, socialism in itself is only a stepping stone to something else. It's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and that end is communism, another scary word. Got chills saying it. I'm sure a few people in the audience did, but it's okay. We're here in the 21st century now. We can say the word communism and get away with it. It's a stepping stone. That's what it is in essence. What it means, that's a much larger, much larger topic. It means obviously many different things, many different people. But again, if you had to draw it down to one sentence, what it means, socialism really is just taking the means of production. So who owns the businesses, who owns the, let's be cliched, who owns the factories? And handing that over from private ownership into the collective ownership of the workers. So instead of one, like the boss owning the factory and having people work and labor in their factory to provide them goods and they pay them a wage, it's owned collectively by the workers. So the workers own the means of production and they decide what to do with the business. That is socialism right there in 2 points. The stepping stone to communism, and really it's all about redistributing the means of production to the people that are actually doing the production. That's it.
And really, because I'm a finance person, naturally I'm going to discuss things, or at least talk about them in a finance perspective, is that in many ways, socialism is basically the inverse of what capitalism is. So the way I'll describe it is you have two companies. You have what, would typically be around at this stage. You have a for-profit company. So a company that has, your upper management, like your CEOs, they have these shareholders, and then you have the workers. However, you also have a company called a co-op, where what you actually have is the workers who elect their officials, and it's much more egalitarian. Now, this again talks about the kind of top-down system that we're referring to and the bottom-up system. And really, they are still working in the same world, as in, it follows accounting rules that there's, assets, there's liabilities, there's expenses, there's income, but there's just two completely different ideologies. Is that the upper management and the workers are pretty much beholden to shareholders, but the management in the co-op, it's beholden to the workers. If they are not doing right by their workers, then the company doesn't function. Whereas in capitalism, in your for-profit company, if you're not doing right by the shareholders, the company doesn't work. And that's what I would distill down as the difference between those two ideologies.
Nice. In like, crystallized or pictured inside those two company structures. So in the co-op, you said that the management structure is working at the behest of the workers. Are they chosen by the workers then? Or are they employed, in a different system? Is it the workers that choose their managers in that sense?
I still have to do a lot more research as to how co-ops work in Australia, but in a broad stroke way, they are elected by the workers. Like, you basically, when you do go into the company, you essentially have instead of being a shareholder, if you are a worker, you are a shareholder. So you have a piece of the pie at the AGM. If if the CEO or the
Mm.
CEO is doing well, then you have your say whether they were doing well or they weren't.
Yeah.
Whereas in a for-profit company, it's the shareholder, it's somebody that pretty much has no relation to how the company works,
Yes.
is dictating, whether the CEO was doing well or not. But
Yeah.
in a co-op, there's a lot more interaction.
Right. Yes. Okay. So in the for-profit version, we've
Yes.
got bottom line
Mm,
profit.
mm,
So you got people, shareholders, driven by
yeah.
a monetary goal.
Yes.
Their ideal there, they've invested capital, and the
Yes.
reason that you have capital is to
Mm.
make more capital. That's the essence of the system, right?
Yes, and also from a socialist perspective, um, in the for-profit company, there's a lot more room for antagonistic relationships. So the CEO or maybe the shareholders, they want to reduce the wages of the workers because they want to increase their profits and they want to increase their dividends.
Mm. Mm.
Whereas you don't encounter that in a co-op because
Right.
your shareholders are your workers.
Yes. And if they did lower their wages, it would be a response to the wishes of those employees.
Yes.
Right, hypothetically, if they
Yeah,
were to choose
hypothetically.
to do that, it would be choice as opposed to it being forced upon them by an outside entity. We're talking about here, like
Yeah.
shareholders who are just
Yeah.
looking to line their pockets so they can reinvest their capital in the next business venture. That's an interesting idea because that is one of the, I guess, if you could set out a list of objectives for socialism,
Mm.
it's one of its real end goals is to basically bring this idea of democracy, this liberal value
Mm.
of democracy into the world, like really into the world. Like, yes, okay, we live in a democracy. Okay, we all say that.
Mm.
You hear this rhetoric all the time. I hear it all the time ever since I've been here. Oh, we live in a democracy, like kind of thing. And it's just like, yes, to a certain extent, you live in a democracy.
Mm.
Okay, yes, you elect your leaders. That is a democratic process, depending on how you define democracy. And that's a whole topic for another time. But let's just go with it.
Mm.
You elect your leaders. Okay, fine. And they
Mm.
represent you politically. So they do diplomatic things. They think about policy decisions. They help govern, the world outside the public space, all that sort of stuff.
Mm.
But like there is a whole nother section, or there are other sections of your life that exist outside of the political realm. You go to work and you live. Those are like the three spheres that are always interacting with one another. And your workplace in a capitalist system is not democratic. You might have democracy in your home. You might sit around the table if you're in a share house and everyone gets to decide who's going to do the washing up or who's going to be on the roster to clean the bathroom this week. That's democracy.
Yes.
Okay. But like maybe you live at home with your parents and you live under a cruel dictatorship and they make you do all the chores in the house because
Yes.
they're just evil people. That's not a democracy. So like we might live in a democratic society in a political sense, but in our workplaces, they're not democratic at all in the slightest. You have a boss, a manager, or what have you, and they directly tell you what to do. They give you instructions. You're not a free person in the workplace.
Yes.
If you don't do what you're told, you're fired. If you don't dress the same as everyone else or dress as you're told, think as you're told, say what you're told, you're fired or you're not accepted into the workplace anymore. No democracy in that. Not at all.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of delving into the idea of a wage slave. And that,
Well, it's just in the essence of socialism trying to achieve something. If you give the people that are in the institution the power, like you would in the political world, you elect your leaders to make decisions on your behalf because you've transferred and you've given them that power democratically.
yeah.
A workplace doesn't, like generally, workplaces aren't like that. They're not democratic. And let's be honest, if you have a full-time job, or even if you don't, you work multiple jobs, you probably work more than someone who's employed full-time. Most
Yes.
of your life is spent working. So most of your life is spent in a system that is undemocratic.
Well, yeah, well, I guess we're kind of critiquing because I'm going to assume, like, obviously there are non-for-profits out there, but a majority of the companies that are in most countries are for-profit companies.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, yeah, hey, even the man at the top, the CEO, the guy who's running the show, um, he's not free within himself, because really, if he does a bad job, the shareholders are more than likely to kick him out.
The
So
home for the real capitalists.
yes.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. And that's why I'm going on this rant for IS, is because an ideal of that, if we go back to that, what are the two real components of socialism? If you provide the workers with the control of the means of production, then you also, by proxy or as a result, are democratizing the workplace, which is a large part of our social relations. We spend a lot of time at work, and work has a massive effect on people mentally, physically. And if you're subjecting yourself to an undemocratic institution on a daily basis, it's no wonder why it slowly destroys people over their working lives.
Yeah.
Or why people wake up in the morning and they're just like, on Monday, like, oh, do I have to do this again? Because they don't have a choice.
And I guess we probably come to another aspect that is a key of socialism, that again, probably nowadays it has a bit of a dirty word attached to it, but the idea of a union. And really, the idea of a union was in view of a structure that is similar to a co-op. If there is a trade union, like for example metal workers, then the metal workers would unite. If for whatever there were conditions that were forced on them that they didn't agree with, there was somebody that would speak on their behalf, or at least was willing to stand up and collectivize with their other workers in order to say to the capitalist, the person who's running that company, that for-profit company, we don't accept these conditions. Like, a lot of people take it for granted, but really it was the unions that promoted and really won through blood, sweat, and tears the idea of 8 hours work, 8 hours for rest, and then 8 hours for leisure.
Yes. Yeah.
That was a union battle, a union battleground that they won.
Bit of solidarity.
Indeed.
Yes. But obviously that is a struggle within the system. Where socialism is an attempt to revolutionize the system.
Yes.
Which would be only the two, which would be the key difference between unionism and socialism. I'm not saying that unionism is not important. Like you said, it's integral. It's the only thing that really, let's be honest, provides working people or has provided the working class with living standards. Like if you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution and how horrendous it was, like people were just tools in a capitalist kind of process. They weren't valued as human beings. And it wasn't until people started banding together and saying, well, if you're not going to treat us right or pay us right, then we're just going to stop working. And that impacted the bottom line, which is what I was talking about before in terms of capitalist ultimate agenda is you invest capital to get it returned to you at an increased amount so you can reinvest it somewhere else. It's profit.
Yes.
And so if you hurt them where in the pocket, where it hits them the hardest,
Hmm.
That is the only way to achieve any type of improvement
Yes.
within the system, within the existing structure.
Yes, the picket line was very much the tool of the union, the tool of the people.
Yes, which was the breeding ground for the ideals that we're talking about, right? Socialism came out of the working class movement. The ideas, in terms of like, okay, it was a philosophy before that, but like, in practice, yeah, it came out of the working class movement.
Yes, and it also links to, well, I guess what we were discussing the other week with liberalism, the Enlightenment liberalism, the idea of fraternity and egalitarianism, and
Mm.
it's basically putting those ideas in action.
Yes, yes, things that were told to people at the end of feudalism. Hey, let's go with this system. Let's go with let's go with democratic style of doing things. Let's elect representatives to do things for us. Let's move into a capitalist mode of production, and everyone will be equal. Everyone will have more freedoms. You'll be able to associate with whoever you please, do whatever you want, and life will be better. And like we've been discussing with the Industrial Revolution, those things weren't realized to a full extent. They were realized for some people, but not the working masses.
Yes, and I think this is another aspect of socialism in the sense of, the funny thing you should mention that is, at least Enlightenment liberalism was the idea of, you had your monarchs, you had your feudal lords and that sort of thing. And liberalism was the achievement of changing the status of power from monarchs to, I guess, the merchant class, or at least the ruling class at that time. So it was passing more power to more and more people within society.
Yes.
But then socialism, because socialism actually sees the merits within capitalism. And
Yes.
but what it does is it sees capitalism as a stepping stone. So it's saying, hey, capitalists, that's great that you gave us more power, you gave us education, you gave us all of these great innovations, but we're going to take the baton from here, and we're going to give more equality to people.
That's right. We're going to continue what you started.
Yes.
If anything, we're going to take that to the next step, and then hopefully pass it on until it's realized for everyone. And I think that's a really good point that you've made there, that I often think about, and that I think people misconstrue about socialism, and particularly about leftism as a whole, is that there is this hatred of capitalism, that there's this innate disdain for capitalists and capitalism. It's just this evil entity. It's just done all the wrong things. It's done nothing for us, so we must destroy it. Like that great scene in that Simpsons episode where Lenin comes out of his tomb and he's just like, must crush capitalism. It's got nothing to do with that. Actually, like you said, like socialists, the ones that know their stuff will be the first to admit how important capitalism is. Like you said, it is the thing that helped, like from an economics perspective, bring us out of the old ways, mercantilism, feudalism, and into the modern era. It helped. Like without capitalist investment, you don't have an industrial revolution. And we're still, we're back in like not the Stone Age, but we're back, living like, peasantry and in like communes and all that sort of stuff. Like the capitalism was so important for being able to just invest a large amounts in able to kickstart industry and kickstart modern technology in the modern industrial revolution. So capitalism was integral to providing, you hear a lot of people, especially defenders, hardened defenders of capitalism, say, well, the reason you have, good living standards today is because of capitalism. Yes, true. Congratulations. That is a very good point. The reason you have an iPhone is because of capitalism. Now, there's an argument against that. No, the reason you have an iPhone is because of labor. But, that's another conversation for another time. But like, yeah, I think it's really important that if we're going to talk about like what socialism is, it's definitely not something that looks to demonize capitalism, and it's all about us versus them kind of stuff. Capitalism is integral. It is on the shoulders of capitalists that socialists stand.
And plus, it's one of those things where, look, Karl Marx wouldn't have spent 3 volumes, and I've been reading these books, they're very thick. If he thought that you couldn't learn anything from capitalism, he wouldn't have spent such a huge part of his life studying what capitalism is.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, if you're dismissive of something, you don't even bother to analyze, the ins and outs of what it is. Socialism wouldn't have put in so much effort to at least understand of, what capitalism is and how we can improve things, if it thought, I don't care about that thing. Like, if you actually do the research into it, it's looking at it and critiquing it and being like, okay, that's a great start, but where do we go from here?
So like, I think then in talking about the perception of capitalism from within socialism, I think it's important then to talk about the perceptions of socialism themselves. And like I touched on this before quite sarcastically, but socialism is a dirty word, communism is a dirty word. Why are these things dirty words? And like, beyond severe propaganda campaigns by the West against countries that have tried to take on communism, Soviet Union, Communist China, the various communist states around the world, like in South America, all that sort of stuff. Why is there this negative perception of socialism / communism beyond just propaganda? It's because of the way that people have interpreted socialism for themselves. It might not have anything to do with the ideology. I don't think it has anything to do with the ideology, as opposed to how people interpret an ideology and then apply it to some type of social structure. So if you go right back to like talking about Karl Marx, and I guess you could say the origins of the people that were looking to put it into practice, not just sitting around like what we're doing and philosophizing, they're actually trying to make something of it and trying to imagine a world where this would be possible. There were, 150 years ago, we're talking, 2 main streams of thought about this.
Yes.
Okay. I think you know where I'm going with this. You have your, let's say, your state socialists or authoritarian socialists, and you have your anti-state socialists, your anti-authoritarian socialists. So you have your, a state, as a country or a socialist mode of organization that is from the top down. That's everything is centralized by state authority. That was the Soviet style, or the Leninist, Stalinist, whatever you want to call it. Soviet style of communism. They had a central bureaucracy, they had a central state apparatus that instituted socialist ideals, socialist ways of progressing their society in whatever direction they thought it should be advancing, as opposed to the anti-state, or some people would call this, here's another scary word, we should have a little scary word count, anarchist ideal. Anarchists, they're anti-state, they're anti-anything state, they're anti-anything authority.
Yes. So
they're the type of socialists that believe you can have all of these, lovely ideas about workers owning everything, and, having truly democratic societies by people freely joining up, freely joining workplaces, freely forming associations and groups that would make societies work like you have in any type of community. you have people that join community associations freely, and everyone works together to make food and work and make society function. There's no overarching authority that dictates to everyone how things are done. Those are the two main strengths of socialist application that are out there, that have been butting heads for 200, almost 200 years now.
Also, I'll just put a footnote there as well, that when I was talking about co-ops and the bottom-ups like structure of things, that sort of egalitarian way of looking at things, as in you have the workers that elect who the CEO is, or at least the person who's in charge. That's a very anarchist way of looking at things, because they love having having Soviets, or the councils, and then it's not a central system, but it's a decentralized way of looking at things, where you have basically the pyramid goes from the base upwards, not the other way around.
Yes. So that's the thing. That's the two types of socialism in terms of in practice: the top-down approach, state-run; bottom-up approach. So you have people that are making the choices at the bottom, and then it's filtering up to people that are chosen to put those things into action.
And I guess from a propaganda perspective, I can't think of many examples of anarchism, but I can think of plenty of examples of state socialism. And I guess if I were a propagandist, and I've got plenty of examples of failed state socialism, and I have a few other ones of anarchism that not many people know about, then I would take the straw man. I would take the USSR. I would take North Korea, and be like, oh, guys, look how bad socialism is. Don't want that.
Yes.
So yes, that's
where it comes down to the interpretation of socialism, the interpretation of communism, that I was touching on before. Look, it's had a bad rap, and notably, like, we're not gonna, we're not just here just to promote certain things. Like, honestly, socialism has had a bad rap, and it's because of people's interpretations of it. The ideology in and of itself is just an ideology. It's not some evil force or something like that controls people and takes them over in the night. It's someone that's put something into practice that people might not agree with. Let's be honest. Someone's tried to put something into practice, and that's why people have problems with socialism. It's also because they don't understand it, obviously, and that's where the propaganda comes in. But it really comes down to the practice, how people have tried to apply it. And like you said, people can point at things and be like, well, that didn't work, and that did work, and that didn't, and that didn't. So they're easily able to critique it or have a misconception of the whole ideology because of a couple of poor examples.
But you can just, even if you look at today's society, that looking for within a company, doing something for a shareholder or doing something for profit, obviously that's a very capitalist way of looking at things. But there's so many aspects of our society that do have socialist values. If you look at any sort of welfare system, so Medicare, like I was mentioning last week, or even the idea of a common area, like a park, or any sort of common space, that's, advocating those sort of things is a very socialist idea. Like having a space that everyone can use at any time, that's very egalitarian.
Yes, it definitely aligns with more of a liberal approach to the idea of freedom. And like you said, the idea of even equality in a sense. Everyone should have equal access or opportunity to something. That doesn't mean everyone should be given something to make that happen, but at least they have the opportunity or the access to it. Now, that is at stark contrast, though, with the other liberal notion of private property. And private property is, I think, the real cornerstone of the capitalist system. If you're looking at liberal values, life, liberty, property, like that was the one thing that really gave people that took from the liberal revolution. So like your French Revolution, your American Revolution, we're talking about here, from those massive, massive game-changing revolutions that changed the world, a couple of hundred years ago or more. From those, you get the institution of private property. You have people that are protecting their rights to own stuff because they're sick of some tyrant coming in and just having some claim over it or taking it away from them arbitrarily. Private property then becomes the cornerstone of the economic way of doing things that then took over the world. And so, yes, there is this large resurgence in the other side of the liberal goals in socialism, which is having a communal, and that's where you get your commune idea. In communism, you have common property, you have common access to things.
Yes.
You don't have people that are taking things for themselves or for their own company or their group or whatever, and excluding other people from it. And that's a very important, I think, distinction between the two systems, is that one is based more on collective ownership or collectivism, as opposed to, I guess, the more, I don't want to say it like this, but I don't know how else to, the selfish side of individualism. It's about protecting one's self-interest, and you can do that through a private property system.
Yeah, and I guess that, well, it kind of goes back into the propaganda that I was mentioning the other week, of the distinction between personal property and private property. Like if I were a propagandist, I would, if I was, if there was somebody like Karl Marx saying like, oh, private property is bad, if I was a propagandist, I would have said, oh, well, they want to take your home away from you. Don't vote for them. Just put them away in a box. But yeah, like the idea of common property, it's in our society.
It's in human nature, I would say.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the most, basic forms of human association, like, going back, tens of thousands of years, about how we used to live more naturally, things were held in common. I think things were held collectively. In fact, the idea of ownership to the exclusion of all others was offensive. And like, it wasn't anyone's right to take that from anyone else. And we've gone a long way on this kind of, it's an ironic term, but like this civilizing of the human race. We've been through this trajectory of, higher civilizations, which has completely ripped us away from a natural state of owning things or existing with things in common, with common value and common ownership and a common interest in things. And that's another thing that I think, socialism, and then that step after it, obviously, communism, seeks to resolve from the capitalist mode of social relations and social organization. So it's interesting, I guess, the view of socialism that's out there at the moment, the perception of it, because I don't think people are ultimately, or really aware of the things that we've touched on here in this podcast so far. I don't think they're aware of these are, I guess, kind of the essence or the objectives of socialism. It's not about, a state-run authoritarian or totalitarian society where everyone looks the same, thinks the same, does all the same things. And, it's majority rules on everything. Everyone's homogenous and there's no expression, and it's all, gulags and, black and really grey scenarios and food stamps and bread lines and all that sort of stuff. That's the propaganda and the evil conceptions out there. And I think that's why it's probably been so, I guess, misconstrued intentionally. It's because if people really knew what it was about, then they might start thinking twice about what's going on around them. There's one for the think tank.
Well, since we were talking about common property, I think this is probably a good segue to talk about, well, actually something that I wanted to talk about, because I've actually been reading a bit of Garrett Hardin this week. And his massive thing, because he's actually an ecologist, and his massive, well, at least his article, the famous article was The Tragedy of the Commons. And it's actually, at least how I would interpret it, is a critique of the bad side of capitalism. So actually, I've got the PDF on my computer, and I'll make sure to kind of share it with people. It's like 7 pages. It's fairly small, but he has a lot to say in those 7 pages. And I guess a best way to kind of describe his theory is via an analogy. So what he talks about is you have 4 farmers, but they basically, where their farm is, it's open field, there's no fences, but all of their cows and their livestock can basically go out into the common space, which is all of the open pastures and fields. And each farmer owns 5 cows. So whenever it's a day, all the cows of each farmer, they go out into the fields, they stamp around, they eat some of the grass, and those 5 cows, so in total, that's about 20 cows, that's sustainable for the pasture of land that is there. However, when the farmer actually looks at the fields, he goes, oh, well, actually, it's in my benefit to own more cows. And there's plenty of land around, so I don't really see the loss in me getting another cow. So he thinks of that. The other farmer has exactly the same idea. And then suddenly all of them get 1 extra cow, so 6, then 7, then 8. And then later down the track, say a year down the track, because what was sustainable for 5 cows has suddenly gone exponentially a rise in cows, and the soil is eroded, there's suddenly less grass, and suddenly that nice green pasture is just tufts of grass everywhere, and suddenly the farmer can't farm anymore on his land because the soil has been eroded. So what was once a great short-term gain, so getting that extra cow, wasn't enough to see the long-term effects down the road. So the common good was destroyed by a short-term gain. And that's fundamentally the tragedy of the commons, is that capitalism, or at least this sort of innovating, it's all for short-term gains and then not looking at the long-term effects. So he goes in, soil erosion with those cows. That's a specific example he does, but that's also the case with pollution. So if I'm not mistaken, because this guy was in the 1960s, I'd be very interested to see whether he was the impetus for ideas such as carbon emission like trading schemes, and the idea of, I know it's a dirty word nowadays, but carbon tax, because he actually speaks in those like, I think it was like page 3 or 4, he speaks about how it's important that a government, or at least somebody in power, like with laws, make sure that individuals clean their pollutants before before they do their business, which is very interesting, because it sounds like it's the precursor to a carbon tax or an emission trading scheme. And he was, I don't think I 100% agree with his ending take, because he talks about um, mutual coercion. So, for example, he uses the idea of, you have public parking. So you as the individual, and you as and the government over there agrees you can park here for an hour, where it's only like a small fee, but an understanding that if you go over that hour, you are going to get fined a considerably more amount. So you're able to share the common space with other people, because you have that coercion hiding above you. I kind of feel like it's a bit idealistic, but it's at least him starting a dialogue of, we are conditioned to think individualistically through capitalism, but it's a really hard idea to get people to subscribe to the idea of delayed gratification. The idea of, well, we want a clean and good environment. We need to not focus on the short-term gain so we can have a better tomorrow.
Right.
And that's fundamentally what the tragedy of the commons is.
Interesting, because it's funny that you framed it like that, that it's actually some form of a critique of our current way of doing things, where people seek to just, I guess, say, have a grab, to profit now, and to hell with the consequences in the future, medium term, long term. And that's actually a critique of how we're doing things at the moment, because I have actually interpreted things and seen the tragedy of commons applied then in an ironic sense, or a paradoxical sense, because it's being used by neoliberals to kind of justify the privatization of things. So if you have a look at how, like, I guess, since the 80s, larger or more dominant economic powers have gone into the third world countries and convinced them to privatize things that were usually held in common ownership, or not even in any form of ownership. They were just kind of national goods that anyone had access to. They used the tragedy of the commons as an example to explain to people why they need to privatize things. Because, you know, if you have everyone accessing something all the time, they're just going to deplete it. They'll just use it uncontrollably. And then no one will get access to it anymore because it's unregulated, and people just destroy things because they're naturally greedy. So you might as well privatize everything, because then once you put a fence around it, once you privatize it, then you can regulate it. And you can make sure that people don't do anything wrong with it. But the real, I guess, agenda behind privatizing things is that you put it into the ownership of someone who then takes it away from the people that were originally benefiting from that thing, and have probably been benefiting from that for thousands of years, or generations after generation, never having a problem with the resource itself, or depleting it, actually looking after it and caring it, and then it's just a reason to privatize things. So I actually thought that the tragedy of the commons was actually a warped way of arguing why you shouldn't have common property.
Well, I guess I'm not in the mind of Garrett Hardin, but at the very least, like, taking that kind of devil's advocate way of looking at things, is I feel like it still fundamentally falls into that trap, because the thing is, every company and probably the law students in the audience will probably agree with me here, is that fundamentally a company is considered an individual within itself. It is a legal entity. And the thing is, if a company is a legal entity and it's acting in individualistic ways, then it falls into that same trap of, oh, let me grab this piece of land here. Let me grab these utilities here, and it basically perverts the common property anyway. So you're the argument that, oh, if you just privatize everything and regulate everything, that's fine. I don't really think that uh, that doesn't sidestep the issue. If you actually look at a company as an individual again, I feel it kind of just feeds into that criticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I was not particularly a big fan myself of the idea of the tragedy of the commons, in the sense that people can't be trusted, individuals can't be trusted to make the right choices. I had a little bit more faith in humankind. It was people that have more private interests and want to see something for their own reasons, that have no regard for anyone outside of that property or outside of their private interests. But like people that hold something in common, and this can be tied back to our socialism versus capitalism discussion before, with people that have some type of collective good, need to protect that and keep that, not just for themselves, but for others as well. So there's like an interesting, and this is going to go way back here, but there's this really interesting document. If you've never heard of the Magna Carta before, the Magna Carta was this, it's like this seminal work in Western culture. It was like basically the basis of the first time that, and this is an English thing, that people sat down with a king and was like, all right, that's enough. You've got too much power and you've been abusing it. It's time for you to hand over some rights to other people. And the king he resisted, and there was a bit of a struggle, but like basically at the end was just like, all right, fine, I'll give you some human rights. So they had things like, justifiable taxation. He couldn't just tax anything he wanted. Like they had like certain human rights, like habeas corpus, like, right to a free trial, fair trial. So they also instituted the rights. A lot of stuff was designed more for the nobility. It was actually the nobility that really had enough with the king and then went to war with him and was just like, pull your head in, mate. So they had more power, and that's where you start to get the beginnings of parliaments. And, you have these House of Lords who kind of check the king to make sure he's not using his absolute power and abusing it. But there was another corresponding document that went with this, and it's something that I don't think anyone really knows too much about, and it was the Charter of the Forest. And it was this first kind of realization of the idea that common property is absolutely integral to human existence. Okay, because at the time, the king that had set this up, I think it was William the Conqueror, had basically turned half of the country, not half, no, actually it was like a third of the country, sorry, into royal forest, meaning like, you hunt in the royal forest, you do anything in the royal forest, you're dead. Or severe punishments we're talking about here. So no one could go into the royal forest. So like basically a third of the land in the country was exclusively used for the king, and that's it. So people had been living off the land, like most of the commoners, so there we go, commoners, would actually live off the land, not just, off the land that they toiled, but they'd go off into the forest to hunt, and they take water from the streams, and they take fuel from the forest in terms of the wood, and they use the lumber to make their houses. They get all of their resources from the land, from common land that isn't actually in ownership by any one sole entity. And part of the Magna Carta, this Charter of the Forest, gave masses of land, recognized first that there is common property. There's this idea of public land, things that should be accessible to everyone.
Yes.
And like it shouldn't be owned, like nobles, the king, didn't matter. If you were from that country, a free man, obviously, but if you were from that country, you had access and the right to be there. It even goes into these crazy details. I read some of it where it's just like, if your swine escapes for the day and enters the forest, you shall not be fined, or you shall not be put in irons, or something like that, for your swine for entering the forest. Like before that was like, punishable offense if like, you let go of your livestock and they went into the forest, but like it made things common. Yes. And it recognized that there are some resources out there that are just better off for people's just standard of living and existence if they're held collectively by humanity and not in private ownership. If humans can't exist where things are completely owned privately and people are excluded left, right, and center from stuff. There needs to be a level of freedom, public space. Like you could just literally, on the commons, you can go wherever you want, move wherever you want, basically do whatever you needed to do to exist. And this was revolutionary in thinking from not just a common sense of like allowing people to do stuff, but from an environmental perspective. Yes. Because it also made of fundamental importance the idea that you had to protect that resource, that like what you were talking about before in terms of the tragedy of the commons, and that idea of protection from pollution and degrading resources for future generations. If they were going to give these lands back to the common ownership of all of the people of that nation or that country, then there would have to be safeguards to make sure that people did the right thing. They didn't just go in and chop all the trees down just because they like chopping trees down. But people would actually look after things and make sure it was held to a certain standard. You didn't if your horse died, you didn't throw him in the river because that was going to poison the water source for everyone, kind of thing.
Yes, yes.
So like that was an instrumental document that a lot of people don't talk about or potentially don't even know about. And it's the basis and this recognition for the first time really in a long time that fundamentally common property is crucial for humanity, and we must protect our environment to a certain degree to ensure humanity's survival.
Okay.
So common property and collectivization or collectivism, these are fundamental ideas to a humane society. And so if we can go full circle here, these are the differences between socialism and capitalism, I find, in the sense that one is based primarily on private ownership and the other is not. It's based on collective ownership. And the focuses are quite different and quite stuck in those regards.
I guess this kind of brings us to the example of the tragedy of the commons, at least in our current day and age. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but I'll just kind of quickly go over this because this is a documentary that you can actually look up on YouTube. And to kind of go over it briefly, it talks about how in Australia, water has basically become a commodity, and not only a commodity in the Murray-Darling Basin and the Murray-Darling River here in Australia. And if you know anything about Australia, water is very scarce here. So just to quickly go over the documentary covers many things, but one of the most shocking things is the fact that you know the journalist basically speaks to people, speaks to farmers in the area of the Murray-Darling, and how all of the cotton farms that are basically north of all of these farmers, they basically bought a majority of the water that that's actually come through when floods come through, and all of these big like multinational farms, they're all cotton farms, and cotton needs a lot of water, and it's just mind-boggling that there are cotton farms in Australia where water is scarce. And it's basically because they're having to take a majority of the water. You can actually like look up Wilcannia and look up the dry riverbeds there. This kind of perverse use of the commons has made other areas of the Murray-Darling basically have no water, or there's been mass fish killings, as in because the waters have become polluted, and this water theft, or at least this taking more than others in the community, it's created a prime example for the tragedy of the commons. And it's a really fascinating documentary, and I recommend people have a look at it.
Interesting. So a real life example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, insatiable greed.
And I know we touched on it last time we were here, Mr. E, but it'll be the first rendition of, what's that, synthwave art. So yeah. Just to give you a clue, you can guess the prompts of the art. You can probably see it in the background there. It's based on what we've talked about. So looking at it, just to kind of describe it to the listeners, it's basically a very colorful background where there's high-rise buildings in the background, and then it's like a swampy sort of foreground where there's like two monsters looking like they're reaching down and trying to pick up something. So I'm genuinely curious, Mr. E, I know what the prompt is. Can you guess what the prompt was?
For this one?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to have to think about that one and get back to you.
Okay, and I guess with that, I guess it's a wrap. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in again this week, and keep learning, keep thinking. Good afternoon and good night. Over to you, Mr. E.
Thank you very much, 4IS. Ladies and gentlemen, you know how it is. I am, you are, we are a mystery.